I should have known something was wrong when he asked whether anyone would notice if I didn't come home. At the time, I thought he was making conversation. My name is Michael Danner, and when Conrad Harrow found me, I was 38 years old and 6 days behind on the rent for a room whose carpet smelled permanently of cigarettes. The Halcyon Motor Lodge charged by the week, though calling it a lodge suggested trees, fireplaces, and some reason a person might choose to be there. It stood behind a truck stop at the edge of Bellwether, with 12 ground-floor rooms facing a parking lot where rainwater collected in oily black pools. I had been living in number 9 for 4 months. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases, and one of those was mostly clothes I could no longer wear to work because the cuffs had frayed. The warehouse had dismissed half its temporary staff at the end of October. Since then, I had carried furniture, cleared gutters, unloaded produce trucks before sunrise, and taken every other cash job that appeared on the notice board in Dorsey's cafe. I was sitting beneath a window fogged by the warmth inside, counting the money in my wallet and deciding whether coffee qualified as breakfast, when a man in a charcoal overcoat stopped beside my table and asked if the empty chair was taken. He was perhaps 50, clean-shaven, silver beginning at his temples, with the composed face of someone who had never needed to check a price before buying anything. His shoes were polished despite the rain. He placed a leather folder on the table, ordered coffee he never touched, and said he represented a private property management company seeking a caretaker for a single night. "Nothing strenuous," he told me. "The house is between permanent staff at the moment. The owner is abroad, and a prospective buyer is expected tomorrow morning. We need someone present overnight to keep the heating running, inspect the ground floor periodically, and make certain there are no problems before the viewing." I asked how he had chosen me. Harrow glanced toward the cafe notice board, where I had pinned a handwritten card offering repairs, lifting, driving, or night work. "You described yourself as immediately available and willing to travel. Those qualities are difficult to find on short notice." The estate lay 70 miles north, deep in the wooded hills beyond Carrow. I would begin at 4 that afternoon and be finished by 8 the following morning. He offered $3,000, $500 in cash before we left, and the rest when he collected the keys. The amount was so far beyond reasonable that I laughed. Harrow did not. "The owner values discretion," he said. "There are paintings, silver and personal possessions in the house. You will be alone with property worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Generous payment helps establish a mutual sense of obligation." He opened the folder and asked to see my driver's license. Then came the questions. Whether I had ever been arrested, whether I drank, whether I was married. I told him no to all 3. He asked if I had children, parents nearby, brothers or sisters, anyone who depended on me. I said my parents were dead, that I had a sister in Oregon whom I had not spoken to in almost 4 years, and that there was nobody else. He asked whether anyone expected me home that night. "The motel manager expects his rent," I said. Harrow smiled politely. "But no one would become concerned if you were delayed?" I shook my head, more embarrassed than suspicious. People with settled lives asked questions like that without understanding what the answers cost. I assumed he was making sure I would not abandon the estate because of some family emergency. He slid 5 crisp $100 bills across the table and gave me a receipt to sign. By the time I had folded the money into my wallet, I had already accepted. I followed his black sedan north in my 12-year-old Ford. Bellwether thinned into wet fields, the fields narrowed into forest, and the road began climbing through hills crowded with bare branches. Rain moved through the trees in silver veils. There were no houses for the final 11 miles, only stone walls furred with moss and occasional iron mile markers leaning toward the ditch. Harrow turned at a pair of gates so tall their spear points disappeared among the overhanging branches. A brass plate set into one pillar bore a single name, Vale. The gates opened before either of us left our cars. Beyond them, a drive curved through acres of winter-brown gardens. Sculpted hedges had grown soft around their edges, and stone figures watched from alcoves darkened by rain. The mansion appeared gradually between the trees, first as a row of pale chimneys, then as a vast grey facade of columns, tall windows and black slate roofs. It was neither abandoned nor decayed. Every pane was intact. Warm light glowed behind the ground floor curtains, and fresh gravel whispered beneath my tires. Yet the building seemed removed from the ordinary world, preserved inside its walls and woods, as though time had been instructed to pass around it. Harrow waited beneath the portico while I carried my overnight bag from the car. He did not hurry, though the afternoon was already dimming. The front doors opened into a marble hall, large enough to contain the entire cafe where we had met. A staircase divided halfway up and curved toward two galleries. Oil portraits crowded the walls. Generations of pale, unsmiling people posed beside horses, hounds, and children who looked as solemn as their parents. Nothing had been covered for the owner's absence. Fires burned in two reception rooms. Fresh white lilies stood beneath a gilt mirror, filling the entrance hall with a sweet, heavy scent. "I thought the staff had left," I said. "This morning," Harrow replied. "They prepared the house before departing." He showed me the rooms I would need: the kitchen, security office, library, boiler controls, and a small sitting room where I could sleep. The estate had its own generator and an old telephone system connected through a private line. My mobile had lost service several miles back. Harrow demonstrated the security panel without inviting me to touch most of its controls. Green lights represented exterior doors and windows. A separate row, all amber, corresponded to the upper eastern wing. "Those rooms contain private family possessions," he said. "They are locked and alarmed. There is no reason for you to enter them." It was the only restriction he gave me, and he spoke of it as a property manager rather than a man reciting some ominous set of rules. He handed me a ring with 6 labelled keys. None belonged to the eastern wing. My practical duties filled half a typed page: check the boiler at 10, walk through the public rooms at midnight, make sure the greenhouse vents remained closed if the wind increased, and admit no one before Harrow returned. The prospective buyer would arrive later with the owner's solicitor. As we crossed the dining room, I noticed that the long walnut table had been polished and left bare except for 2 places at the far end. One setting held an overturned wineglass. Beside the other stood a vase containing a single red rose. "For tomorrow?" I asked. Harrow looked at the table for a fraction too long. The staff sometimes prepare more than they are asked to. He guided me onward. On a stand near the rear doors hung a woman's dark green coat, its shoulders beaded with rain. A pair of narrow leather shoes rested beneath it. Harrow passed them without comment, and I decided they belonged to a housekeeper who had forgotten them. That explanation was easier to accept than the alternative. We returned to the entrance hall at 5:15. Outside, evening had gathered beneath the trees. Harrow paused with one glove on and the other still in his hand. "Mr. Vale is a private man," he said. "You may encounter things that strike you as unusual: family photographs, medical equipment, locked rooms. None of that concerns tonight's work. Do what you were hired to do, and tomorrow morning you will leave with $2,500. You make the place sound haunted." His expression did not change. Old houses accumulate stories because people find ordinary silence difficult to tolerate. I watched his taillights travel down the drive until the woods swallowed them. A moment later, the iron gates closed in the distance. Their meeting produced a sound like a hammer striking deep underground. For the first hour, nothing happened. I made coffee in the kitchen, inspected the boiler, and ate 2 sandwiches the staff had left beneath glass in the refrigerator. The house was warmer than my motel room and quieter than any place I had ever known. Silence did not simply occupy Halcyon Estate, it seemed to have weight. Small noises crossed impossible distances. A pipe ticking behind a wall sounded like a fingernail tapping wood. Rain at the library windows resembled whispering in another room. I tried the telephone shortly after 6, intending to tell the motel manager I could pay him in the morning. The receiver produced no dial tone. I checked the security office and found a red indicator beside the words external line. Harrow had mentioned storms sometimes interrupted the connection, and the rain had grown harder, so I put the receiver down. The $500 in my wallet made every inconvenience seem temporary. The library occupied the western side of the ground floor. Shelves rose to a painted ceiling, and a rolling ladder ran along a brass rail. I had never understood why wealthy people kept thousands of books they could not possibly read until I stood there and realized the books were part of the architecture, as essential as the columns and carved mantelpiece. Family photographs occupied a table near the fire. Most showed an older man with an angular face and iron-grey hair, whom I assumed was Gideon Vale, the estate's owner. In each picture beside him stood the same woman. She was younger by at least 20 years, with dark hair, fine features, and a distant expression that never quite became a smile. A silver pendant rested at her throat in every photograph. In one, she stood beside Val beneath flowering trees. In another, they attended some formal dinner. The newest photograph showed them on the mansion steps, Gideon's hand placed possessively at the back of her waist. On the silver frame, someone had engraved Gideon and Eleanor, Halcyon, 2019. There was something odd about the picture that I could not name at first. Then I noticed Eleanor's eyes. She was looking toward the camera, but her body leaned subtly away from her husband, the muscles at her jaw tight beneath the skin. I thought of Harrow's warning about private family matters and returned the frame to its place. At 7, I heard footsteps on the floor above me. They crossed from right to left, slowly and distinctly, pausing each time the old boards creaked. I stood beneath the library doorway and listened. The sound continued along the gallery toward the eastern wing. A door opened. Then came a soft closing click. I searched the public rooms first, calling out that I was the caretaker. No one answered. In the entrance hall, the amber lights on the security panel still burned steadily, showing the eastern doors as secured. I told myself an old house shifted when its heat came on. That explanation lasted until I reached the upper gallery and smelled perfume. It was delicate, floral, and unmistakably fresh. The scent led toward the eastern wing, where a pair of white double doors divided the gallery. Both were closed. A brass lock sat beneath the handles, and a small red light indicated the alarm was active. I stopped several feet away. From the other side came the faint scrape of something moving across the floor. "Hello?" I said. "Is someone in there?" For several seconds there was only the rain. Then a woman whispered, "Did he leave?" I stepped closer. "Who?" The door handles shifted once, gently, as if someone on the other side had tested them. "The man who brought you." "Mr. Harrow?" No answer followed. I asked her name, told her I had been assured the house was empty, and said I could call the police if she was locked inside. The absurdity of that promise occurred to me when I remembered the dead telephone, but I had already spoken. A shadow moved through the narrow line of darkness beneath the doors. "You should go," she said. "I can't leave you locked in there. You don't understand. Go before it gets late." The shadow withdrew. I heard quick footsteps recede into the wing. When I tried the handle, the alarm gave a soft warning chirp, and I released it. Every amber light remained steady when I checked the panel downstairs. I searched for another telephone and found two, neither working. Then I went outside. The rain had turned cold enough to sting. I drove down the long curve toward the entrance, feeling increasingly foolish and increasingly afraid. The gates did not open. There was a keypad on the inner pillar, but no intercom, only a metal plate covering what looked like a key slot. None of Harrow's keys fit. I reversed, tried calling from every corner of the drive, and watched the words "no service" remain on my screen. When I attempted to start the Ford again, the engine turned over, but would not catch. I sat with both hands on the wheel, staring through the rain at the locked gates. The car had been unreliable for months, so sabotage was not my first thought. It should have been. I lifted the hood and found the battery connected, the belts intact, and nothing obvious I knew how to repair. By the time I walked back to the mansion, my coat was soaked and the windows above the portico had gone black. She was waiting inside the entrance hall. The woman stood halfway up the staircase in a long cream dress, one hand resting against the banister. Her dark hair hung loosely around her face. She looked exactly like Eleanor Vale in the photographs, except thinner, almost ill. A bruise darkened one wrist. The silver pendant was still at her throat. "Mrs. Vale?" I asked. Her gaze moved toward the doors behind me. "Did you try the gate?" "Yes, it's locked. My car won't start, and the phones are out." She closed her eyes as though I had confirmed something she already feared. He always makes certain of that. I thought she meant her husband. The possibility arranged every strange detail into a shape I could understand. The restricted wing, the alarm, Harrow's warning, a frightened wife hidden while the estate was shown to a buyer. "Did Gideon Vale lock you in this house?" Eleanor descended 2 steps. Her bare feet made no sound on the carpet. "What did the man ask you before he brought you here?" "I don't know. Normal employment questions." "Did he ask about your family?" I said nothing. "Did he ask whether anyone would know where you had gone?" She continued. Her voice remained soft, but something in it had changed. Not enough to frighten me, only enough to make me listen. Whether anyone would come looking? The questions from the cafe returned with their politeness stripped away. Wife, children, parents, someone expecting me home. I felt the first clear movement of panic beneath my ribs. Why did he ask me those things? Eleanor glanced up toward the eastern gallery. "My husband keeps records in his study. If you need proof, that is where you will find it. The door beside the library, the one with the black handle." Proof of what? But she was already climbing the stairs. I called after her. She stopped near the top without turning and said that you were never hired to leave in the morning. Then she passed beyond the gallery and disappeared. Gideon Vale's study had been locked during Harrow's tour, but the smallest key on the ring opened it. The room smelled of leather, dust, and the same sweet lilies that filled the entrance hall. An enormous desk faced the windows. Its surface was immaculate except for a blotter, a capped fountain pen, and a silver letter opener shaped like a narrow leaf. I searched the drawers, ashamed of what I was doing, until I found the first file. It contained copies of temporary employment forms. Each described a single-night position at Halcyon: security guard, furnace technician, inventory clerk, animal control contractor, emergency gardener. The names went back almost 9 years. Some pages bore photographs paper-clipped to the corners. Beside each photograph, someone had typed brief observations. No spouse, estranged adult daughter, lives alone, recently evicted, cash employment, no fixed address, transient, uses assumed surname, minimal risk of inquiry. The newest form had my driver's license photograph at the top. Beneath it were the answers I had given Harrow in the cafe, reduced to 5 merciless lines. Unmarried, no dependents, parents deceased, estranged sibling, out of state, temporary lodging, disappearance unlikely to prompt immediate report. Across the bottom, in dark blue ink, someone had written approved CH. I backed away from the desk. My hip struck a cabinet, and a stack of narrow account books shifted behind its glass doors. Their spines were marked only with years. I pulled out the most recent and opened it. Most entries were ordinary estate expenses: roof repairs, heating oil, garden staff, imported wine, medical supplies. Every few weeks, however, a payment appeared beneath the initials CH. The amounts varied. Beside them were short descriptions written in Gideon Vale's precise hand. Night arrangement completed. Suitable provisions secured. Refused livestock. Alternative required. The final entry was dated 3 days earlier. Eleanor restless, Harrow instructed, 1 adult male sufficient. Below that, added the same morning, were 2 words, delivered tonight. A floorboard creaked behind me. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She no longer looked frightened. Her shoulders were relaxed. The bruise had vanished from her wrist, and a small smile rested on her lips. "You found it," she said. I lifted the ledger between us. "What does this mean?" Her eyes moved across my face with quiet interest. "It means Conrad chose well." I seized the silver letter opener from the desk. It was a poor weapon, but holding it kept my hands from shaking. "Stay back." Eleanor's smile widened. "He told Gideon you were practical. Lonely, but practical. I wondered which part would win." She stepped into the study and closed the door behind her. The motion was calm, almost graceful. I demanded that she open it again. Instead, she tilted her head and drew a slow breath through her nose. The sound seemed to deepen as it entered her, becoming rougher, wetter, far too large for the narrow chest beneath her dress. "You smell afraid now," she whispered. "You didn't before." Her face changed first. The skin around her mouth tightened and pulled backward, not tearing but rearranging itself over bones that lengthened beneath it. Her jaw descended with a muffled crack. The delicate chin thrust forward, the lips peeling from rows of narrow teeth that no human mouth could have contained. Her eyes sank into dark hollows as the brown irises clouded to a dead, reflective grey. Then her spine rose beneath the cream fabric, each vertebra pushing against the dress until the seams split from her shoulders to her waist. What unfolded from Eleanor Vale's shape was taller than any man, thin without being weak, its limbs stretched into predatory lengths. Grey skin clung tightly to its ribs, its knees bent at a subtle, sickening angle, and its fingers reached almost to the floor, ending in dark nails curved like hooks. Torn strips of the cream dress remained around its shoulders and hips, swaying as it straightened. The silver pendant lay against a chest that no longer moved like a human chest. I could not make myself run. Every instinct I possessed seemed to collide at once, leaving me rooted beside the desk with the letter opener raised. The creature crossed the room before I saw it move. One hand struck my forearm. The letter opener spun away, and pain flashed from my wrist to my shoulder. Its other hand closed around my coat and lifted me from the floor. For one suspended second, I stared into Eleanor's ruined face and understood that it could kill me without effort. Then it hurled me across the study. I crashed through a small table and struck the bookcase hard enough to empty my lungs. Glass burst beneath me. A broken edge opened my palm when I tried to rise. The creature watched from beside the desk, its head angled with the same curious expression Eleanor had worn in the photographs. I crawled toward the door. It allowed me to reach it. I dragged myself into the library, slipped in my own blood, regained my feet, and ran. Behind me came no pursuit, only the soft scrape of nails passing over the study doorframe. At the entrance hall, I looked back. The creature stood beneath the library arch, tall enough that its shoulder brushed the carved moulding. Slowly, deliberately, the bones of its face shifted. Grey flesh softened, the jaw shortened. Dark hair spilled over one shoulder until Eleanor Vale was smiling at me again from inside the torn remains of her dress. There was nothing frightened or human in the smile now. It was the wife's face being worn for my benefit. "Leave," she said gently. I stared at the locked front doors behind me. Eleanor laughed. The sound began as a woman's laughter and ended as something dry and ravenous. Her face stretched apart once more, and the creature lowered itself onto its long limbs. "I'm coming." The first thing I did was run. I threw myself against the front doors, twisted both handles, and felt the locks hold. Behind me, nails clicked once against the marble. The creature did not rush. It remained beneath the library arch, folded low inside the torn cream dress, watching while I wasted precious seconds fighting doors I already knew would not open. When I looked over my shoulder, its mouth widened. It wanted me to understand that the choice of direction belonged to me only because it had permitted one. I ran through the dining room and struck the table hard enough to send one of the place settings across the floor. Porcelain shattered behind me. I passed through the baize door into the service corridor, found the kitchen, and seized the first thing my hand closed around, a heavy carving knife resting in a wooden block. I knew how useless it was. The letter opener had done nothing except make me feel armed, and the creature had taken it from me as easily as a parent removing scissors from a child. The kitchen contained 3 exits. One returned to the dining room, one led toward the rear hall, and the third opened into a walk-in pantry. I chose the pantry because its door had a lock. Shelves crowded the narrow room from floor to ceiling, holding jars, dry goods, and folded linens. I shut myself inside, turned the key, and pressed my bleeding palm against my shirt. My wrist had begun to swell, and each breath drove a blunt ache through my back where I had struck the bookcase. For a while, the only sound was rain rattling against the distant windows. Then Eleanor's voice spoke from the kitchen. "Michael?" It was soft and frightened again, the voice she had used behind the eastern doors. The creature did not restore the woman's shape or attempt to convince me that what I had seen was unreal. I heard the scrape of its long nails moving across the counters and the wet pull of its breathing. It was simply using Eleanor's voice because it knew the sound had once made me step closer. "I told you to leave," it called. "Why are you hiding?" The pantry handle turned. When the lock stopped it, the creature gave a low, almost thoughtful sound. A nail entered the gap beside the door and drew downward, peeling a pale curl of wood from the frame. It could have torn the door apart. Instead, it scratched 3 slow lines into it and walked away. I waited until the sounds had faded before moving. At the back of the pantry, partly hidden by hanging aprons, I found a narrow door without a knob. A recessed iron ring pulled it open. Cold air breathed through the gap. Beyond it lay an unlit passage scarcely wide enough for my shoulders, with bare brick on one side and the mansion's interior walls on the other. The old staff must once have used it to move between rooms without crossing the formal parts of the house. That was how Eleanor had left the sealed wing without disturbing the alarms. Halcyon's doors did not contain her. They only directed the people brought there into believing she was contained. I entered the passage and eased the door shut behind me. My phone's flashlight revealed pipes, electrical wire, and a row of tarnished servant bells mounted high along the wall. Small brass labels named the rooms they had once answered: morning room, library, east bedchamber, conservatory. A frayed cord dangled beneath the final bell. Farther ahead, the passage divided around a vertical shaft containing a dumbwaiter. One branch descended. The other climbed through a cramped wooden staircase toward the eastern wing. I should have gone down. The ground floor offered doors, tools, and the possibility of reaching my car. Instead, I climbed. Eleanor had sent me to Gideon's study because she wanted me to learn what had been done to the people before me. If the creature enjoyed understanding, there might be something in the private wing it had not intended me to find. More than that, I needed to know what it was. Until then, I had been running from something that could enter locked rooms, wear a woman's face, and cross 20 feet faster than my eyes could follow. Knowledge seemed like the only weapon in the house that it had not already proved useless. The stair ended behind a wardrobe. I pushed through hanging coats and emerged into a bedroom untouched by the warmth of the rest of the mansion. Heavy curtains covered the windows. Medical equipment stood where a dressing table should have been: an oxygen cylinder, an intravenous stand, an old heart monitor, and a steel cabinet filled with empty glass vials. Dust lay thick across most surfaces, yet the bed sheets were clean. Leather restraints had been fixed beneath the mattress and concealed by the hanging coverlet. On the wall above the bed hung another photograph of Eleanor. She was lying in that same room, diminished by illness, while Gideon sat beside her holding her hand. Someone had written February 3rd on the white border. No year was given. The drawers contained folded nightdresses, perfume, letters, and a journal bound in cracked red leather. I carried it into the adjoining bathroom, locked both doors, and sat on the floor with my back braced against the bath. The house had fallen silent again, but it was no longer an empty silence. I felt the creature moving through it even when I could not hear it, pausing outside rooms, testing the air, letting the game lengthen. The journal belonged to Gideon Vale. His earliest entries described doctors, treatments, and the slow failure of Eleanor's body. The words were controlled at first, full of appointments and medicines, but the handwriting deteriorated as her condition worsened. She died shortly before dawn on January 11th, 9 years before Harrow found me. Gideon refused to send her body away. He kept her in the eastern room for 2 days, dismissed the nurses, and had her carried through a private passage to the Vale family crypt beneath the estate chapel. 3 nights after the burial, Gideon heard her voice outside his bedroom. He wrote that Eleanor returned barefoot, wearing the burial dress and silver pendant he had placed around her neck. She knew his name. She remembered the house, the melody he had played for her on their wedding night, and words they had spoken when no one else was present. For several pages, Gideon insisted that grief had been answered by a miracle. Then the entries changed. She would not enter sunlight. She would not eat ordinary food. She watched the servants from behind doors and repeated their private conversations in Eleanor's voice. When Gideon cut her hand, the wound closed while he watched. When he brought a priest to the estate, she broke the man's neck before Gideon could explain why he was there. The photographs taken after Eleanor's death had been part of Gideon's deception. He staged dinners after dark, paid guests to remain silent, and occasionally allowed the creature onto the front steps at dusk, so the outside world would continue believing his wife lived in seclusion. The picture dated 2019 had not shown Eleanor leaning away from her husband. It had shown the thing wearing her body while Gideon held it close. Near the center of the journal, one sentence had been written so deeply that the pen had nearly torn the page. Whatever returned from the crypt is not my wife, but it carries enough of her that I cannot destroy it. The creature had consumed more than Eleanor's body. Gideon believed it had absorbed pieces of her memory and learned to hold her shape. He confined it first with locks, then iron gates, reinforced doors and blackout curtains. None worked for long. He tried feeding it cattle, pigs and deer taken from the estate. It ate when starving, but became violent afterward, tearing rooms apart and stalking the staff. The first deliberate human feeding was a groundskeeper named Amos Reed. Gideon wrote that Reed had no close family and had been planning to leave the county. The entry ended with a line that made my stomach turn. No inquiry followed. Eleanor calm for 26 days. Conrad Harrow appeared in the journal several months later. Gideon described him as a discreet contractor who understood that certain wealthy clients required problems solved without questions. Harrow did not know the creature's origin, and Gideon did not choose the people he brought. The arrangement was brutally simple. Gideon sent word when Eleanor needed feeding. Harrow found someone isolated, desperate, and easy to explain away. Sometimes he called the job security work, sometimes groundskeeping, repairs, inventory, or private transportation. Gideon paid without requesting names. I turned page after page, reading only fragments. Some victims had been killed quickly. Others had been allowed to run through the mansion for hours. Gideon noticed the change and recorded it with the detachment of a man observing an animal in a cage. She has learned anticipation. Hunger alone no longer explains the pursuit. Another entry, written 2 years later, read, "She let the woman reach the gate before bringing her back." Harrow recommends removing the interior release. The final pages contained notes from a private physician. Most concerned tissue samples and failed sedatives, but several lines had been underlined. Prolonged exposure to unfiltered daylight produced immediate blistering, loss of assumed human characteristics, and severe tissue degradation. Artificial ultraviolet exposure caused pain but was insufficient to destroy it. All east wing windows had subsequently been fitted with blackout shutters and treated glass. A scratching noise travelled across the bathroom's outer door. I closed the journal. The sound moved from one side to the other, stopped near the lock, and became a gentle knock. "You read slowly," Eleanor's voice said. The door bent inward before the final word had faded. Wood cracked around the hinges. I crossed the bathroom, unlocked the second door, and stumbled into a dressing room as the first door tore free behind me. A grey arm swept through the opening. Its hooked fingers missed my coat by inches and buried themselves in the plaster wall. I reached the wardrobe passage and pulled it shut, but the creature struck the other side before I had taken 3 steps. The panel burst open. I fell down the narrow staircase, catching myself against brick with my injured hand. Pain whitened my vision. Above me, the creature folded its limbs into the passage and began descending headfirst, its shoulders scraping both walls, the torn dress hanging around its inverted body. I ran toward the lower branch. At the pantry entrance, a hand closed around my ankle and pulled my legs from beneath me. My face struck the boards. The carving knife slid from my belt and vanished into the dark. I kicked blindly and felt my heel connect with something hard. The creature dragged me backward until its breath warmed the back of my neck. One nail entered my thigh. It did not stab deeply enough to cripple me. It opened the skin with deliberate care, drawing a line of pain from above my knee toward my hip. I screamed and twisted onto my back. The creature crouched over me, its hollow grey eyes fixed on my face. Blood darkened one curved nail. It brought the nail to its mouth and tasted it. Then it released my ankle. For a moment I did not understand. I scrambled away, gained my feet and limped through the pantry. Nothing followed. Eleanor's laughter drifted from the hidden passage, fading behind the walls. That was when I understood that I had never escaped it. Not in the study, not in the pantry, not in the eastern wing. Every locked door I had reached, every passage I had discovered, and every second spent reading Gideon's journal had been given to me. It was not chasing because it needed to catch me. It was measuring how much hope I could recover before taking it away again. The kitchen clock showed 11 minutes past 10. Dawn was almost 9 hours away. I wrapped my thigh with a dish towel and bound my palm against my chest. Then I took Gideon's journal, a flashlight, and a box of matches from the kitchen. I returned to the security office because I could think of nowhere else to go. The room had one solid door and no windows. On the wall beside the alarm panel hung a framed plan of the estate marked with power lines, water valves, and fire partitions. The eastern wing was veined with service passages. So were the cellar and the rooms around the greenhouse, which the plan labelled conservatory. The greenhouse projected from the southeastern side of the mansion. Its roof vents were operated by hand because the old electric motors had failed. A red notation beside them read, "Must remain closed during high wind." The duty Harrow had included to make his offer sound legitimate was real. So was the weather. If the rain passed before sunrise, and I could draw the creature beneath that glass, the vents would expose the room directly to daylight. Surviving long enough to use it was another matter. I locked myself in the security office and turned off the light. The creature visited 3 times over the next several hours. The first time, it walked past without touching the door, dragging one nail along the wall. The second time, it stopped and spoke in Harrow's voice. "Mr. Danner, open the door. The assignment has been cancelled." When I remained silent, it laughed with Eleanor's throat. The third time came shortly after 1 in the morning. The handle turned and the door shook once in its frame. Then nothing happened for so long that exhaustion overcame fear. I do not know whether I slept for minutes or nearly an hour. I woke when every light on the security panel changed at once. Green became red. Amber went dark. Somewhere in the mansion, doors began unlocking in sequence. The office door opened by itself. I ran before the creature reached it. The house had changed while I hid. Fires had died in the reception rooms, and the halls were cold enough for my breath to show. Several chandeliers had gone dark. The ghoul moved through the shadows without haste, sometimes above me, sometimes inside the walls. Twice I saw its shape at the end of a corridor. Each time it remained still until I turned away. At 2, it drove me into the cellar by smashing through the door behind me. I descended stone steps and found the rooms where the previous victims had ended. Shoes had been arranged along one wall in pairs. Wallets, watches, phones, and pieces of jewellery filled labelled crates. Harrow had stripped away anything that might identify the dead before removing what remained of them. The oldest chamber held bones beneath a layer of quicklime. Some were scattered, others had been stacked with administrative neatness. I found my overnight bag on a table beside an empty crate. A label had already been prepared and attached to it, M. Danner, Personal Effects. The creature watched me discover it from the top of the stairs. I fled through a coal passage and emerged outside near the estate chapel. The rain had weakened to a fine mist. Beyond the trees, the sky remained black. I could have hidden in the woods, but the perimeter wall was too high to climb with one hand and an injured leg. The gate was half a mile away across open ground. Gideon's journal had already told me what happened to the woman who reached it, so I returned to the mansion. The ghoul followed. Sometimes it pursued close enough that I heard its hands strike the ground behind me. At other times it disappeared for an hour, leaving me to wonder whether I had finally lost it. Whenever that hope began to feel real, Eleanor's voice would speak from a dark room or a long grey hand would pass slowly around a doorway. By 5, I had stopped believing I could survive. My thigh bled through the towel, my wrist had swollen until I could no longer bend it, and breathing deeply sent pain through my back. I sat beneath the greenhouse potting bench with Gideon's journal pressed against my chest and thought of my sister, Laura. We had not fought about anything important. Our silence had begun with unanswered calls, then pride, then the embarrassment of allowing too much time to pass. I wondered how long it would take her to learn I had died, or whether Harrow had been correct and no one would ever tell her. The eastern horizon began to pale shortly before 7. The storm moved south, leaving broken clouds over the woods. Grey light gathered against the greenhouse roof. I rose from beneath the bench and examined the room. Iron-framed glass covered 3 walls and the pitched ceiling. Canvas shades had been drawn across the eastern panes, probably to protect the creature if it wandered inside after sunrise. A crank wheel near the door controlled them. Another opened 6 narrow roof vents. Both mechanisms groaned when I tested them. The ghoul heard. It appeared in the doorway connecting the greenhouse to the morning room, no longer pretending to search. Dry blood covered its chest and one hand. The remains of Eleanor's dress hung from its body in dirty strips. It had spent the night granting me choices. Now the approaching light had made it impatient. I turned the shade wheel as quickly as my injured hand allowed. Canvas began lifting from the eastern glass. The ghoul crossed half the greenhouse. I abandoned the wheel and limped between rows of stone planters, knocking clay pots into its path. It moved around them with contemptuous ease. One hand struck the back of my coat and tore the fabric from shoulder to waist. I reached the roof vent crank and threw my weight against it. Nothing moved. Rust held the gears. The creature seized me by the throat and lifted me against the glass. Its face hovered inches from mine, jaw hanging open, Eleanor's grey eyes reflecting the growing morning. The game had ended. There was no amusement left in it, only hunger. My feet searched for the floor and found the iron crank handle. I kicked it downward. The mechanism broke loose with a shriek. 6 panels along the roof opened at once, and cold morning air poured into the greenhouse. The ghoul dropped me and recoiled. A narrow blade of sunlight had entered through the easternmost vent, crossing its shoulder. The skin began to smoke. It screamed with every voice I had heard that night. Eleanor, Harrow, and beneath them something without words. It sprang toward the morning room doorway. I seized the heavy irrigation lever beside the crank and drove it through the handles, pinning the double doors closed just as the creature slammed into them before it could reach the morning room. The glass walls shook. The lever bent but held. Clouds moved across the sun, and the burning slowed. The ghoul turned toward me. Half of its shoulder had blackened, but it was still fast. I was trapped in the greenhouse with it, and the roof vents admitted only thin strips of direct light. I grabbed a long-handled pruning hook from the potting table and swung at the nearest eastern pane. The glass cracked, but did not break. The creature came across the room on all fours. I struck again. A white fracture spread from the hook. On the third blow, the pane burst outward into the garden. Morning flooded through the opening. The ghoul hit me before the light fully reached it. Its arm drove me across the floor, and my head struck the base of a stone planter. For several seconds I saw nothing. When my vision returned, the creature was crouched over me, one claw raised above my chest. The clouds parted. Sunlight moved across the greenhouse floor and touched the creature's back. Its body arched. Grey skin split along its spine, releasing smoke and a foul, sweet odour like meat left in a sealed room. It tried to retreat beneath the canvas shades, but I caught one hanging cord and pulled with both hands. The remaining covers rose together. Light filled the greenhouse. The ghoul staggered among the plants, striking blindly at the air. Eleanor's face pushed through its own for an instant. Not restored, not human, but trapped beneath the burning surface like an image seen under water. Its mouth formed Gideon's name. Then the face collapsed, the jaw widening beyond speech as fire moved through the thin body without any flame I could see. It reached the broken window. Sunlight poured directly over its head and shoulders. The creature fell against the stone floor and convulsed until its limbs drew inward. Skin blackened, tightened and separated from the bones. Within minutes, the thing that had hunted me through Halcyon Estate had become a twisted mass of ash and dark tissue inside the shredded remains of Eleanor Vale's burial dress. Her silver pendant lay untouched beside it. I remained on the floor until the sound of the entrance gates woke me. The greenhouse clock showed 7:43. Through the broken pane, I saw Harrow's black sedan moving up the drive. He parked beneath the portico and entered the mansion, carrying the same leather folder he had placed on the cafe table. He expected to find the house quiet, my possessions boxed, and whatever remained of me ready to be removed from the cellar. I took Gideon's journal, the employment file, and the ledger from the study. I could barely walk, but Harrow went first to the security office and then toward the cellar, following the routine he had probably followed dozens of times. I slipped through the rear service door and crossed the side lawn to his sedan. He had left the keys in the ignition. As I started the engine, Harrow emerged beneath the portico. His composure vanished when he saw me. He ran toward the car, shouting for me to stop, then reached inside his coat. I drove before I discovered whether he was carrying a telephone or a weapon. The gates had remained open behind him. I passed through them with Harrow running down the drive in my mirror, growing smaller until the trees hid him. His phone lay in the center console. I called the police before I reached the main road. They found Harrow at the estate, trying to burn the records in Gideon's study. They found the cellar before the fire spread, along with the possessions and remains of many more peoples. What lay inside the greenhouse was taken away by a federal team that arrived before sunset. The official report called it unidentified biological material. The photographs taken by the first deputies disappeared from evidence, and none of them would speak publicly about what they had seen. Gideon Vale was arrested 6 weeks later when he attempted to cross from Switzerland into France. Harrow gave investigators the names of 2 other men who had found victims for him, though he continued insisting that he had never entered the greenhouse and did not know what Gideon kept in the house. Perhaps that was true. It did not make him less responsible. He knew the people he delivered never came out, and he had learned how to recognize those whose disappearance would leave the smallest disturbance behind. I spent 11 days in the hospital. My wrist had been fractured, 2 ribs were cracked, and the wound in my thigh required 31 stitches. The motel manager threw away most of the belongings I had left in room 9, but I no longer cared. The state placed me in temporary housing while the investigation continued, and a victims fund eventually gave me enough money to begin again. On my second night out of the hospital, I called my sister. Laura answered after 3 rings. I had prepared an explanation, but when I heard her voice, none of it seemed useful. I simply told her my name and said I was sorry. There was silence on the line. Then she began to cry, and I realized she had missed me long before I disappeared. I had only made it impossible for her to say so. People later asked why Gideon Vale had done it. The newspapers described grief, obsession, and the delusions of a wealthy man who believed the creature was still his wife. They were wrong about that last part. Gideon's journal proved he knew exactly what lived in Halcyon Estate. He fed strangers to it, not because he believed it was Eleanor, but because destroying the thing would have forced him to lose her face a second time. Conrad Harrow had understood something equally terrible. A person did not need to be truly alone to vanish. He only needed to believe he was alone strongly enough to stop reaching for anyone. That was why he chose me. It was also why he was wrong.